Welcome back everybody to our studies in GCSE History for AQA. In this video we are continuing talking about conflicts and tension in the interwar years, and we're going to spend some time in this video focusing on the League of Nations. This is the next major topic. This topic will be concerning basically all aspects of the League of Nations, its successes, its failures, its origins, some of the things it did, some of the things it didn't do, and then that will move us on quite nicely to looking at the 1930s in the next topic and thinking specifically about the rise of the Nazis and Hitler's development of Hitler as he becomes more and more aggressive in power. So fundamentally then, this is going to be a video overviewing the League of Nations. And I want to begin by just talking about the origins of the League of Nations and its adoption. So the adoption of the League of Nations came as the result of the Covenant of the League of Nations. I'm going to apologise in advance straight away because I realised that this is a very, very small amount of text. I will read to you on screen everything that is out, but if you're looking at this in a classroom, for example, maybe have a look at it on your own laptop when you get home or something. Again, apologies for that. Anyway, the Covenant of the League of Nations. This serves as the sort of founding charter of the League. It's sort of the big document that is the thing that forms the League of Nations. And it's very similar to the United Nations. The United Nations has its own charter as well, the UN Charter. It might be, you could say it's almost like the constitution of the League of Nations. And it is incorporated as part of Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed on the 28th of June 1919, and it comes into effect on the 10th of January 2020. The drafting and the establishment of the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, is a collaborative effort. It is a collaborative effort that is led by Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Robert Cecil and Jan Smuts of the British Empire, Léon Bourgeois of France, and other representatives that came from countries such as Italy, Japan, Belgium, Greece, China, Poland, Romania, Serbia, and Czechoslovakia. There's also others. There's Brazil. There's also part of that. Greece. I've already mentioned Greece. But it's quite a large collaborative effort. The sort of those who were the drafters are Woodrow Wilson, Robert Cecil, Jan Smuts, and Léon Bourgeois. But the other collaborative effort comes from a variety of different states, a variety of different countries around the world. Notice that this is not just European countries. We've got also Japan. We've also got China, and we have Brazil from Latin America. So quite a large collection of different countries. At its core, the League of Nations Covenant aimed to, quote, promote international cooperation and to achieve international peace and security. It would codify this basic aim by establishing a number of obligations. These obligations are to avoid war, to practice open diplomacy, so openly negotiating trade agreements and other kinds of treaties and deals, to uphold international law. This is a sort of body of law that is the sort of law between states, essentially, so law as it applies to different countries. Now, the development of international law comes a lot after the end of the Second World War, but at least prior to the Second World War, in the first in the sort of interwar period, there is still this establishment of this body of law that we call international law. International law is a lot older than a lot of people think. And then the final point is to honour treaty commitments. If you sign onto a treaty, you should honour the commitments that you espouse in that treaty, and you should be duty bound to honour, and everybody should honour the treaty commitments. In international law, this is a basic Latin maxim known as pacta sunt servanda. For those of you who want to maybe go on to study international law in the future, that's a free little ticket for you to use as a bit of information for you right there. In terms of the sort of structural framework of the League, Each of the different articles of the Covenant establish a number of different things, a number of different aspects. The sort of main organs of the League, and by organs we mean the different institutions of the League. So, for example, if we make a quite quick comparison to the United Nations, the organs of the United Nations are the various different institutions. So the General Assembly, the Security Council, those are the sort of organs of the UN. In a similar sense, Articles 1 to 7 of the Covenant establishes both membership and the various different organs of the League of Nations. So Article 1, for example, establishes membership protocols. Articles 3 to 4 created the League of Nations Assembly. The League of Nations Assembly is a little bit like the UN General Assembly in the sense that all members of the League of Nations have a presence there. It's like a big parliament, if you will. Then when we look at Article 64 also establishes the Council, which is where we see a number of permanent major powers as well as elected members. And so the Council is a little bit like the Security Council in the UN, in that you have sort of permanent members and you also have some elected members that come and go throughout time. The Article 5 of the Covenant establishes the requirement that there needs to be unanimity for Council and Assembly decisions. So, if the Council of the League of Nations wants to make a decision, every single country that is part of the League of Nations will have to agree to that decision. If the Council wishes to make a decision, every single one of the major permanent members, as well as the elected members of that Council at that time, have to all agree. We will note that this is a bit of a problematic aspect of the League of Nations, the requirement for unanimity, given the fact that where there is geopolitics, where there is sort of global politics and sort of international relations, there's a lot of disagreement among states, and so there might be a lot of deadlock, and so unanimity is not often a very good system for establishing and creating rules of international law, for example. And there are various institutions that have that problem as well, even to this day. And then finally, Articles 6 and 7 forms and establishes the League of Nations Secretariat. The seat of the Secretariat is in Geneva and has equal opportunity positions for various different member states. Articles 8 and 9 concerns one of the main jobs of the League of Nations, at least early on in its creation and its establishment, because one of the major issues is disarmament. The world has just seen a world war, and so we need to disarm a number of different countries and sort of have a sort of global disarmament policy and campaign, because A, we don't need all these weapons anymore, but secondly, it also reduces the chances of war taking place again in the future if people aren't as armed to the teeth in terms of countries. And so disarmament is established with Articles 8 and 9. Specifically, Article 8 it tasks the Council with proposing a number of plans for disarmament, the aim of which is to reduce armaments to the lowest point consistent with national safety. That is the sort of quote, the lowest point consistent with national safety. This included oversight over munitions production as well, so the creation of new armament. Article 9 created a specific commission. It created the Permanent Disarmament Commission. Articles 10 to 17 concerns the idea of what is known as collective security. The idea here that there is the respect for territorial integrity. So Article 10 binds members to uphold each other's territorial integrity and their political independence. So all the countries and all their borders have to be recognised by all the other countries. Article 11 stated that any war or threat of war was a matter of concern to the League, which would then prompt appropriate action to maintain peace. So the idea of war is not just a matter that is of concern for the countries that are involved, it is also a matter that is of international importance. It is a matter for the League of Nations. Article 12 encourages members to submit disputes to what is known as an arbitration, a way of sort of arbitrating the different disputes, sometimes known as the judicial processes. And then Articles 13 and 14 establishes one of the mechanisms, one of the organs of the League of Nations that can actually be used to adjudicate disputes. This is the Permanent Court of International Justice, where decisions are to be honoured in good faith, and if you have a dispute, instead of going to war with a different country, you can take that country to court, essentially. Skipping ahead a little bit, I'm just going to skip to Article 16, which declared that a member resorting to war in violation of the procedure for starting a war would be deemed to have committed an act of war against all members. And that would then result in all the other members severing trade, finance, and social ties. And the Council could also even recommend a collective military action. So let's say that a country like Japan declares war on a country like China and does so without resorting to the League, without using the League as a method or an avenue for trying to resolve the dispute peacefully. Then the attack on China would be considered an attack on all members of the League of Nations, and all members of the League of Nations would then have to respond by cutting off trade, by cutting off any kind of financial or social ties, and even in some extreme circumstances, it might prompt collective military action. It might prompt other countries to get involved collectively to try and support the security of a country like China, for example. Finally, Article 17 allowed non-league members, non-league states, should I say, to engage in disputes, that are engaged in disputes, to be invited to assume obligations of membership for the purpose of that dispute, which is a very interesting part of the League of Nations membership. Essentially, it says that if you're not a member of the League, but you have some kind of dispute with a member of the League, you can actually take up and sort of assume some of the obligations and some of the privileges of being a member of the League, even if you're not one. Finally, I'm just going to very quickly run through the last parts of the Covenant, Articles 18 to 26. We can see that Article 18 mandates the registration of all treaties to be public, so sort of a sense of open diplomacy, no secret treaties behind the scenes. Article 20 voided any treaty that was inconsistent with the Covenant, which is quite simple. Article 22 is a very important one because it instituted what is known as the mandate system, which we'll get to in a second or in a future video. But one of the things that we had to deal with at the end of the First World War is the collapse of all of these different empires. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and so too did the German Empire, and so too did the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire both collapses. But both the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire have colonial holdings. They have territory overseas. They have territories in Africa and in the Middle East that are formerly part of colonies. Well, in the sort of spirit of managing those territories, but also in the spirit of not wanting to sort of dominate those territories and just take them over as colonial subjects, the mandate system created a system in which those former colonies would be managed by other empires, by the British and by the French specifically, under the guise of trying to sort of bring them into a sense of statehood. The idea being is that these countries in Africa, these countries in the Middle East are not advanced enough to be able to run themselves as countries. And so what we're going to do is we'll look after them for a few years to try and bring them up to the fold to the point in which they can actually eventually become countries. Very patronizing, of course, very paternalistic approach to native and indigenous populations, but a sort of like colonialism light, if you will. It was still colonialism in all but name, but it had this sort of end point in mind, the idea that it wouldn't be a system that existed forever. The mandate system was established by Article 22. So let's just talk a little bit about the real-world impact and some of the shortcomings associated with the League of Nations. We will get to this in far more detail in future videos. As you can imagine, this video is far too long already and far too technical, so I'm just going to be go through this very quickly. The League does have some limited diplomatic success very early on, for example, like the Albania-Yugoslavia border dispute. That was resolved by the League in 1921. The Upper Silesia plebiscite. A plebiscite is like a referendum, which is like a sort of vote on a thing. So like the Brexit referendum, for example, was a referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom would stay in the European Union or not, and people get to vote on yes or no, whether or not that's the case. A plebiscite is something kind of similar. The Upper Silesia plebiscite concerned a dispute between Germany and Poland in 1922. You also have the Greece-Bulgaria dispute in 1925. There are also humanitarian efforts, so the returning of prisoners of war. There was the helping of refugees during a war in 1922 between Greece and Turkey, and there is also the freeing of around 200,000 slaves from Burma and Sierra Leone. There is the establishment of the Permanent Mandates Commission, which monitored the territories of the mandates that we looked at on this previous slide. But despite all of this, of course, there are very much a number of different shortcomings that we need to make very, very clear. At the very beginning of this video of this series of videos on the League of Nations, I want to make it very clear that the main issue, or one of the main issues, was the fact that there was an absence of key powers. There was no United States, there was no Soviet Union, there was no Germany, okay? At various different stages, the Soviet Union and Germany did in fact join the League of Nations later on, but then they would leave quite shortly afterwards. At least at the very beginning of the League of Nations, the fact that the United States never joined because the Senate refused to ratify the treaty due to its opposition of Article 10 of the League of Nations, which Article 10, of course, bound members to uphold each other's territorial integrity and political independence. They saw that as overly binding, essentially. We can see that that the League was going to start off with a real difficult issue, in terms of being able to enforce some of its major commitments. Another example of its structural weaknesses includes the fact that unanimity is required for every single decision. Again, we'll get to why that is a problem in future lessons as well. We can see that historians critiqued the League of Nations as being quite idealistic but quite toothless in terms of its ability to get anything done. The historian E.H. Carr, for example, Carr spelt with 2 R's, called the Covenant scraps of paper when confronted with power politics. And we'll see that Carr is very much correct in his assessment in future videos and in future lessons' time.